are listening to a podcast from The National.
The biggest mistake we make in understanding the conflict in Yemen is simplifying it. Boiling it down to a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or a sectarian battle between Shia versus Sunnah, or even a crisscrossing conflict between political parties. Yemen cannot be understood by those modern lenses that we use to comprehend international affairs. To understand Yemen, one must first and foremost grasp the weight carried by the dozens of tribes who each have their own history, alliances, and ties. To add to that, those lines are seldom concrete as they shift along the landscape of a country under the social and economic strain of war. Understanding the country requires ears open to the ancient past and the individual thoughts of Yemenis today as they contemplate a future that is seldom represented by any one authority in the country. So perhaps to understand Yemen, it's best to turn to poetry.
من لي بمثل فوارس من نوعهم لا يرتدون أذل ورجاء.
That's a jihadist poem recited in Arabic by Professor Elisabeth Kendall, an Oxford University academic who's just returned from Yemen researching the country's eastern tribes.
And those are just two lines from a much longer poem. I like to recite them because they're so indicative of the kind of power that the poetry can extend. You know, it's talking about lions plunging into battle and, you know, the world has never witnessed the likes of knights like them, fearless and not postponing the battle. And actually, what those lines referred to was simply a group of young teenage extremists who were rumbled in a safe house and shot dead in cold blood. But, you know, the poetry can reconstruct a completely different story around the reality of events.
This is Beyond the Headlines. I'm Naser Al Wasmi. On today's show, Yemen, as well as ISIL's last stronghold in Iraq, and a pioneering Emirati woman. This week in Yemen, former President Ali Abdullah Saleh all but broke off ties with the Houthi rebels. Often referred to as a marriage of convenience, the fracture could spell a behind-the-scenes peace deal that could end the conflict with the Saudi-led alliance. I spoke to Professor Elisabeth Kendall earlier to get her thoughts on the situation in Yemen. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking.
You're in a unique position. From what I understand, I think last week you were in Yemen. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing there and what your research focuses on.
I was in Yemen, and it's a rare privilege these days to be able to travel and research in Yemen. But luckily, I have the protection and, I hope, friendship of some of the tribes in the east of the country. What I've been trying to do is, in return for their assistance in helping me unravel some of the poetry I look at in my research, I've been helping them think through their priorities and their social and political agenda, and helping them try to reach an international audience with their thoughts. And so we have various projects that we're trying to get off the ground, ranging from providing utilities like water and electricity to a much more major struggle with trying to update education for them.
The tribes in the east of the country, I take these are the Hadrami tribes, if I'm not mistaken?
Well, I work with Mahri tribes mainly, which are even further east than the Hadrami tribes. And in fact, it's interesting you should mention that because there are some tensions between some of the Hadrami tribes and some of the Mahri tribes. There's a little bit of a territorial dispute going on currently. And well, in fact, it has been for centuries.
Yemen is one of the most politically, socially convoluted countries in the Arab world. And to add on top of that, there's been a war that's been raging in the country for the last 3 years. Tell me, I mean, you get this kind of microcosm. Give me a bit of an understanding of where the different tribes stand, especially the ones that you work with, the Mahri tribe. Where do they stand in terms of the conflict that's happening now?
Well, you're certainly right to call it convoluted conflict. It sure is. Now, where I work in the far east of Yemen, the tribes there have never really, in general, considered themselves a full part of Yemen as we know it today within its borders. So, for example, when I did some survey work 3 years ago, most people were neither for the so-called revolution nor against it. The vast majority claimed to be completely indifferent to it. Now, nominally, you would see on paper that these Far Eastern tribes are pro the so-called legitimate government of President Hadi. But, frankly, it's really much more a case of wanting to have their rights, have control of their territory, be in charge of their security, and be fairly treated. And it's got little to do with being anti-Houthi or pro-government. It's much more about just being themselves. And you'll find that some of the leaders in the eastern region are, although nominally aligned to the legitimate government, so-called legitimate government, they're really just conducting business as usual. This is where the very lucrative smuggling routes that are generated via the far eastern coastline and the eastern border come into their own, because there are certain people becoming very rich off the back of the war economy.
In the apparent vacuum of power, or in the the conflict that's sprung in the country, do these tribes find themselves with more authority of their lands, or are they maybe a bit less empowered right now?
Good question. I think the tribes always had more control over what went on in their territory than perhaps we were led to believe by the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who formed some quite tricky alliances with different leaders. But it is true to say that the fragile state of Yemen at the moment in a war context means that tribes are perhaps in more control than they were in recent decades, and that it's actually very difficult for regional representatives of the so-called legitimate government to control them.
Ali Abdullah Saleh, the man was in power for 33 years. Again, we've talked about how politically fractured, or how many tribes and how many different powers there are in the country. He's almost just in the last 4 years, without talking about his reign, he's gone back and forth between throwing his weight between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. Did he kind of cut his teeth in one of the most difficult countries to rule in the Arab world? Is that why he's so opportunistic right now?
You're certainly right in describing him as opportunistic. Some of the material he came out with in his speech at the weekend, talking about just wanting to act for the good of the Yemeni people and questioning, finally, his alliance with the Houthi rebels, was quite hard to swallow for anyone who had actually followed his 30-plus year career. Because it's fairly clear that he has always ruled in his own interests, or in the interests of retaining power, and not necessarily in the interests of the Yemeni people themselves. But he is very good at it. And what worries me is that the international community will be tempted to wheel him back in as a way to try to break the Houthi rebel alliance and end the stalemate of the war. But there is a danger in that, and the danger is that it will simply see old elites being brought back, the same elites that led to the so-called revolution in the first place, and we will continue to see instability, dissatisfaction, and the same old elites ruling in the same old way.
Professor, you speak Arabic fluently. You listened to both Ali Abdullah Saleh's 15-minute speech on Monday, and you listened to Abdul Malik al-Houthis speech as well over the weekend. Can you tell me a little bit about the language that they use and how it represents their persona with their constituents, or Yemen at large?
Well, it was clear that Ali Abdullah Saleh is the much more experienced politician here. He understands which watchwords to wheel out. He understands how to appeal to a sense of nationalism and moderation, the kinds of things that his international audience and perhaps a more cynical domestic audience might want to hear. Abdul Malik al-Houthi sounded much less confident. He sounded more extreme, more defensive, less fighting than Ali Abdullah Saleh. And I think that speaks to the nature of their alliance entirely. It was always a marriage of convenience. Quite an unlikely marriage on the surface, but not when you consider how opportunistic Ali Abdullah Saleh has been throughout his career.
In both the speeches, they touched upon the idea of peace, which was a bit surprising. And then, of course, they did break away from each other. But going back to your research, I mean, and moving forward, how would peace be spelled out to the tribes, not only in the ones that you work with, but at large? I mean, how would it really reflect on their interests?
Well, peace would have to take account of the regional aspirations and hopes, politically, socially, economically, and actually try to find interlocutors with those tribes who genuinely speak for them. It's very easy for a sheikh sitting in a patchu in Sana'a to claim to speak for certain tribes, or for the international community to forge alliances with those key people whom it knows from years and years back, say those who left at the end of the 60s or those who left during the Civil War in 1994, and think that they still hold some sway. You know, often they don't. And Yemen, with a population explosion at the moment and a great many young people, just cannot keep control now by those old patronage networks. And any peace going forward needs to take account of that. What I would suggest is using a better methodology for identifying interlocutors who genuinely speak for tribes, and not just resorting to lists of ready-made representatives and interlocutors who may have been relevant in the 1970s or the 1990s, but are perhaps no longer relevant. We need survey work to help identify what those hopes and aspirations are, and we need to make sure that those regional communities around Yemen, around the whole of Yemen, are bought in to whatever processes and power-sharing agreements are made.
Professor, thank you so much for sharing your fascinating work with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking.